Good evening, y'all. Welcome to the Church of the Heavenly Rest. My name is David Romanek, and I have the great privilege of being the rector here. And I have the great privilege of welcoming you this evening for our second evening with Kathleen Norris, who I think has already become a friend of Heavenly Rest. And so we are delighted to introduce her today. As I greet you this evening, you'll want me to thank our sponsors, especially our primary sponsor, which is the Galloway Memorial Fund of the Heavenly Rest Church Foundation. The Galloway Fund was established in 1989 by Joe Galloway to memorialize his son, Brant Austin Hines Galloway. And it is for special Christian education programming, and so we've used it for this. But we've also used it for things like furnishing the upstairs of the children's wing, the children's education wing, and several other things. You can make a gift to the Heavenly Rest Church Foundation if you'd like to support things like this. And so if you're interested in making that happen, let me know. I'd be happy to talk to you about it. But in the meantime, I also want to acknowledge our presenting sponsors, the Department of Religion and Philosophy at McMurray University, the Honors College at McMurray, the Department of English at ACU, and also Highland Church of Christ. And a special thanks to Highland because they really helped us out with some of the promotion for this event. And I see many faces from Highland, or as I like to refer to you, our siblings across the street. So welcome. I did want to invite you, if you are interested in supporting, continuing to support events like this, to make there's an alms basin back there. You can make a contribution. Or if you're feeling tech savvy, there is this little card in your pews, and you can apparently scan the QR code and go to our website. My phone doesn't do that, but I believe it most people's does. And then finally, I want to say a special word of thanks to 7-in-1 booksellers who have been sort of our pop-up booksellers for this event. It's so cool that we have a place like that in Abilene, and so I'm really grateful that they've given their time and their talent to us. I also want to acknowledge our good friend Daryl Tippins for helping to arrange the introduction between Heavenly Rest and Kathleen, and I also want to say a special thank you to our associate rector, a good friend, and someone who helps make ministry happen at this place, Corey Capes. So thank you for, give her a round of applause. Last night, someone asked me, so Father David, when did you first learn about Kathleen Norris? And I was trying to rack my brain and remember, and I assumed it was when I read Cloister Walk, but then I realized it was when I read an edition of Mere Christianity, for which she had written a foreword. And I just remember what her name looked like on the cover. And the other thing I remember is how compelling I found those few pages in introduction. How much they invited me into a place of reflection, a place of openness, a place where I was preparing myself to experience something of the holy. And I think that that's true for a lot of people who have read Kathleen Norris. I mentioned this on Sunday, but our bishop, who is here this evening, when he came to this diocese, he mentioned that Bishop Sam Holsey, who was the bishop at the time, required new clergy in the diocese to read Kathleen Norris's Dakota, because it was so descriptive of life in a place like this. And again, I think part of what is so powerful about a text like that is that it prepares you to apprehend the holy. Kathleen, in her writing, and I think we discovered in her talking as well, reveals something essential about what faith is, and explores, and I think embodies what it means to be a person of faith. I did want to read again from Daryl Tippin's description of Kathleen because it's very well written, as you might expect from Daryl Tippin's. Kathleen Norris is the award-winning poet, writer, and author of many New York Times bestsellers, including Cloister Walk, Acedia and Me, Dakota, and Amazing Grace. And no one quite writes like Kathleen Norris, particularly about religious topics. She's blunt, funny, unpredictable, insightful, and refreshingly original. Her first career was as a poet, and her gift for lyrical precision shines in all her prose as well. Few question the cliches and pieties of our day like Norris, and few writers of faith today deal as directly and honestly with matters of doubt, despair, and faith as honestly as she does. Norris has an uncanny gift for exposing and making sense of the central paradoxes of the Christian faith. And once again, for that reason, will you help me welcome her to our pulpit?
Well, thank you for that wonderful introduction. And I have to start out like I did last evening with poetry. I am an evangelist for poetry. That's how I satisfy all the many generations of Methodist pastors in my blood. Actually, my family's history and ministry goes back to the 15th century in England. And I just love to, last night I read a beautiful poem by Denise Levertov, and tonight I'm going to read one of my own. Emily Dickinson, whose birthday is coming up, I think, in the 10th of December, I believe, 193 years old, venerable woman. But she really, what she has written, she's my favorite biblical interpreter. She's a lot more fun than those 19th century Germans. And consider the lilies is the only commandment I ever obeyed. Yeah, that's in one of her letters. But one of her other letters when she was a teenager, you know, there is no account of her death in the Bible, and why am I not Eve? And that got me thinking, and it inspired this poem. It's called A Prayer to Eve. Mother of fictions and of irony, help us to laugh. Mother of science and the critical method, keep us humble. Muse of listeners, hope of interpreters, inspire us to act. Bless our metaphors that we might eat them. Help us to know, Eve, the one thing we must do. Come with us, muse of exile, mother of the road. I owe it all to Emily. Well, this is, as I said last evening, this is one of the best invitations I've ever received, very open-ended. And to give a talk on the subject of invitation, I found a wonderful quote recently from St. Francis that talks about, of Pope Francis, who basically says, God never stops inviting us. The invitation is always there. And when I was thinking about invitation, I thought about the invitation I received when I was a child, sitting on my mother's lap as she played the piano and we sang from the Child's Book of Hymns. When I realized that those black markings on the page had meaning for her that I didn't understand, that was my invitation to the world of reading. But this evening I want to discuss a more recent invitation, something that might surprise you a little, but it's been life-changing for me. When a man, a writer and film critic I met at an Image magazine conference, invited me to join him in producing a weekly e-newsletter on movies. We'd met just the day before, but had found a deep connection in our love of cinema. I'd been a film nerd ever since I was a teenager. On Saturdays in Honolulu, when most of my classmates were at the beach, I was sitting in a dark theater watching the works of Ingmar Bergman. But I'd never before written about movies. Yesterday, our little newsletter called Soul Telegram, one word, Soul, S-O-U-L, Soul Telegram, sent out its 100th issue. and it's been a delight to work on it. We're not doing film criticism, but we're introducing people to movies that we feel will add to their understanding of the world, other people, and their own lives. The best response I've ever received came from a Benedictine monk after I had given his monastery a free subscription. "Most of us will never see the films you write about," he said, "but we love hearing about them." That's my perfect audience. Well, what I've discovered is that films, and especially foreign films, offer us a unique invitation to broaden our view of the world and the people in it. And that's what I want to discuss this evening. I've been astonished to find, for example, that contemporary Iranian cinema is one of the wonders of the world. The news we receive about Iran is so bad, about their oppressive government and that persecutes its own people and funds terrorist groups throughout the Middle East. But in watching films set in Iran, I find ordinary people going about their lives, working, marrying, having children, arguing, divorcing, farming in dry and stony landscapes, contending with urban traffic, and trying as best they can to avoid the attention of the government authorities. I've also discovered inspiring film directors there who have faced down the Iranian regime, living under surveillance and sometimes being sent to prison, but persisting in making films, inviting us to witness to the truth about life there. The Iranian director Jafar Panahi is one of my heroes. He got in trouble with the government for his 2000 film called The Circle, depicting the situation of women in Iran. It opens in a hospital waiting room as a woman paces in front of a door to a maternity ward. When a nurse opens it to offer congratulations as her daughter has given birth to a healthy girl, she doesn't reply. Fearing the serious repercussions that are sure to come when the in-laws learn that the baby is not a boy, she turns to them and says, "There's no news yet." This film and subsequent ones in which Panahi depicts the precarious lives of Iranian women and children and the poor caused the government to send him to prison for, quote, propaganda against the state, unquote. One film was a comedy, in 2006, Offside, based on a true story of women arrested for trying to attend a soccer game. The film depicts women who've been caught at a World Cup qualifying match. They're in a holding cell at the stadium, and a young soldier takes pity on them and agrees to watch the game through a peephole and report on the action. It's a wonderfully comical setup in an unfunny situation, revealing the way that in Iran, both women and men are often trapped in absurdities. Well, the authorities failed to see the humor in Panahi's films, and on his release from prison, he was forbidden to make movies for 20 years. So in 2011, for his next movie called This Is Not a Film, he made a documentary. Except that, strictly speaking, he didn't make it. Panahi had friends film him in his pleasant upper-middle-class Tehran apartment, discussing his life and work. We meet some of Panahi's neighbors and learn that when the police arrested Panahi, they stormed his apartment in a terrifying raid. Panahi still seems stunned that the authorities are so afraid of him and his films that they would do this. As an artist, he feels called to depict reality, or as he puts it, reporting to history. But this is clearly not acceptable to his government. To help Panahi get the international attention that would help him avoid more persecution, friends put the film on a flash drive, smuggled it out of Iran inside a birthday cake, and showed it at the 2002 Cannes Film Festival. It was shortlisted for an Oscar as Best Documentary that year. If I put all of this in a novel, critics would accuse me of exaggerating, but that's what happened. For his next film that he didn't make, Under the Ban, it's 2015's film called Taxi. Panahi posed as a cab driver and placed a rear-facing camera on the dashboard of a taxi. I found this film fascinating for what it reveals about present life in present-day Iran. One passenger reports that he was mugged, and though he later recognized his attacker in the street, he decided not to report him as too many petty criminals were now being executed. And he didn't think he deserved that. Another customer, a young man selling bootleg videos, recognizes the director, and we're amused to learn that Panahi once bought Woody Allen's Midnight in Paris from him. The man is delivering DVDs to a film student in an upper-class neighborhood who is thrilled to meet Panafi, but he's more excited about receiving a DVD of The Walking Dead Season 5. Who knew? Who knew? When Panafi picks up his sassy young niece from school, she tells her uncle that she and her classmates have been assigned to make a short film. The teacher has advised them not to show any woman who's not wearing hijab or portray any conflict between men and women. They are to avoid unpleasant subjects altogether, what the teacher terms sordid realism. As Panafi listens to his niece's patter with a poker face, surely he recognizes his own films in the teacher's admonition. Panafi has arranged to pick up a friend, Nasrin Sadohe, a human rights attorney who has helped him in the past. She's recently been released after being in prison for 3 years and is carrying roses that were given to her from the family of a young woman she defended who was imprisoned for attending a volleyball game and is now threatening a hunger strike. One brief moment in this film, Taxi Stopped Me Cold. As Sadohe is leaving the cab, Panafi suddenly gets out himself and looks around. "I thought I heard something," he said, "my interrogator's voice." This made me realize that when Panafi was repeatedly interrogated in prison, he'd been blindfolded and never saw the face of the agent who was interrogating him. All the better to make a prisoner feel afraid and alone and helpless. I'm not sure if another cake was used to get Taxi out of Iran, but it won an award at the Berlin International Film Festival. And that woman, Nasrin Sadohe, was recently arrested again. I don't know if she's still in prison or not. Another Iranian film that won a major prize at the Berlin Festival is Mohammad Rasulov's 2020 film called There Is No Evil, shot in secret in Iran and smuggled out of the country. The film disturbed the Iranian regime so much that the director was not only forbidden to leave the country to accept the award, he was sent to prison. The film concerns the moral issue of personal responsibility in a system that requires its citizens to blindly obey official orders. It gives us 4 stories about people caught up in what amounts to Iran's execution industry. The first segment depicts the life of an ordinary middle-aged worker. We don't know what he does for a living, but we see him shopping for groceries with his wife and daughter, and also helping to prepare a meal for his elderly mother who lives alone. Going to work in the early morning, the man doesn't drive on when a traffic light turns green, but he stares into space. It's not until later that we realize why. At work, he walks down spotless corridors and makes coffee in his small office. He takes no notice of a panel with red and green lights on the wall until an alarm sounds and the lights turn green. What he does then is something that no one who sees the film will ever forget. We witness a perfect illustration of the term, the banality of evil, as men die. Another segment takes place on a farm lush with greenery where a young man is making a surprise visit on the birthday of the woman he intends to marry. Before climbing a trail to her family's house, he stops to change out of his military uniform. He tells the girl's father that his 2 years of compulsory military service are almost over and that he's brought an engagement ring. Sensing that something is unusual, he discovers that before the family celebrates the girl's birthday, they will host a memorial service for a man who has recently died, who was like family to them. When his fiancée places flowers and a large photograph of this man in the living room, the young man is horrified and runs away. His fiancée finds him weeping by the river down the hill, and he confesses that he had helped execute this man in order to get 3 days leave. He'd been told the man was a criminal, but she says he had been arrested for his political beliefs. And then she begins to calculate all the times he had gotten leave in order to visit her, now knowing what each visit represented. "I'll miss you," she says as she heads up back the hill alone. There are 2 more segments to that film, but those 2 I think were the most powerful for me. An earlier film by Rasulov called 2013, a film called Manuscripts Don't Burn, invites us to take a sobering look at the ways writers try to cope with life under a severely oppressive regime. The phrase "manuscripts don't burn" comes from The Master and Margarita, a biting satire of Stalin's regime by Russian novelist Mikhail Bulgakov. The phrase became popular in the Soviet Union, referring to writers persecuted by the government who preserved their works by memorizing them rather than putting them on paper. While Russolev is arguing that literature is eternal, his film reveals how far a government will go to try to destroy it. Shot in both Iran and Germany, the making of this movie was such a risk that the actors and crew are not named in the credits. This film is based on something I didn't know anything about, and that's one of the but answering this invitation to learn about movies has been quite an education for me. It's based on what has become known as the chain murders, the government-sponsored assassination of more than 80 Iranian intellectuals that took place after the Iranian Revolution between the early 1980s and 1998. Russolev gives us parallel stories of two hired assassins, several writers under surveillance, and a man who, after serving jail time as a dissident in his youth, is now making a career for himself in the secret police by betraying former colleagues. Police eavesdropping has revealed that one writer, established but now infirm and banned from publishing, has written an eyewitness account of an event that occurred in 1996. And this is true, this is a true story. When the Iranian government hired a driver to kill a busload of 21 writers on their way to a conference in Armenia. He was to steer the bus off a cliff, jumping out at the last minute. Incredibly, the driver made 2 attempts, failed attempts, and no one died. But I just thought, wow, this is a true story. Well, the writer's former friend, who's now his case officer, visits him and makes an offer. He can leave Iran for medical care and visit his daughter in Germany if he turns over the manuscript. Promised that he will be able to leave in 2 weeks, the man turns over his original, but then police surveillance reveals that he's distributed several copies. The film then becomes a kind of thriller about government agents tracking down every copy and killing those who have them. We encounter sadness upon sadness as we witness callous betrayals and the horrific brutality of a government determined to erase the truth and the people who tell it. And one of the saddest things in that one of the assassins is a man who's just trying to raise money for an operation for his son. He's not a career criminal, he's not a terrible person, but he's caught up in this awful situation. Russolev's film is an invitation to witness the truth. A humanist at heart, he makes us feel the pain of people trapped in a corrupt and cruel system that seeks to erode not only their freedom, but their humanity. That some resist seems a miracle. An earlier and much lighter Russolov film is a 2008 documentary called The Dish, and it provides a good look at how people rebel in a country where the government tries to control access to information. When satellite dishes became available in Iran, the regime could not prevent people from obtaining them. We visit a remote village that had received electricity just a few years before and learn that while the elders fear that the satellite dish will corrupt the town's youth, exposing them all to scantily clad women in Egyptian variety shows, the young people mainly want to watch soccer matches. In Tehran, we see entrepreneurs taking advantage of an excellent market for the dishes. As police confiscate the rooftop dishes, customers are already ordering replacements. It's comical, but also a valuable reminder that the human hunger for information is difficult to suppress. Get a sip of water. I'll make one last note about Iranian cinema. Something that makes me happy, but I'm sure does not please the government there. Panafi, Jafar's son, has made his first film, 2021, called On the Road. It's about a couple taking their oldest son from Tehran to a place in the countryside where it turns out, you learn this gradually, they will pay people to smuggle him into Turkey. Their son's interest in Western culture, including films, has gotten him into trouble with the authorities. The family feels like any family, its members bickering like crazy, but sustained on a bedrock of mutual love. The parents are making a huge sacrifice. They're losing their son and also their home because they've mortgaged their home to get this young man his bail and to pay for this trip. And they can't tell their rambunctious younger son, a really delightful character in the film, they can't tell him the truth about their trip. He thinks they're going camping. And one of the most beautiful scenes at this campground, they are camped out, there are other families doing exactly the same thing, having smugglers take their young people into Turkey. The young little boy is looking up, as he lives in Tehran, which is a pretty major city, so he doesn't see that many stars. He's lying in his little sleeping bag under the stars, and he looks up, God, what a beautiful world you made. It's just a lovely scene. So this is a sad movie that is somehow full of hope and a great debut for this director, Panafi's son. Well, writing for Soul Telegram, I've learned a lot more about how films invite us to understand more about history, but I think it also helps us to better understand our world today. I recently came across the films of a Senegalese director. It's a centenary of his death this year. His name is Ousmane Sembène, and it's given me a better grasp of why in France's former colonies like Mali and the Sahel, even though the French army has been providing valuable security against Islamic extremists, the people want them gone. That colonial history is really much more painful, I guess, than I had ever realized. Like many African men, Sembène was drafted into the French army to fight in Europe in World War II. And that was something, again, I didn't know. His film that he made in 1987, Camp de Thiaro, shows troops who had fought in the war in Europe for years. If they were captured, they were sent to Nazi concentration camps because they were black. When they returned home to a temporary transit camp, colonial officials offer them half the pay that the French government had promised them. The men protest nonviolently, but the French officers are so alarmed by their defiance of authority that after they promised, you're going to get your full pay, they promised them that, and only one of the people in the camp figures out they're probably lying. But after they have done that, in the middle of the night, one night, they send tanks to shell the camp and kill all the soldiers. It's a fictional film based on a real massacre that occurred on December 1st, 1944. After watching several films set in Ukraine, one from the 1920s called Arsenal, which long before computers and CGI, there's a spectacular train crash in that film, just brilliant. And you think, why do you need CGI? You can do it. They did this in the 20s. You can do all this cool stuff. And there's a recently stunning film called Atlantis, a very prophetic film. It's set in 1925 after the war, and it was made a couple years before the war. So it's a really interesting film partly about the people, this group that goes around collecting corpses from any side. It doesn't matter who they are, but they try to repatriate them, treat them with respect, find a place to bury them. But after watching these films set in Ukraine, I have a somewhat better grasp of what's happening there. One thing I learned is that the first time a Russian government lied to the people of Ukraine about respecting their national sovereignty was during Lenin's regime in 1918. History really does repeat itself. Two films, The Ascent and In the Fog, set in Belarus during World War II, invite us to understand the terrible pressure people there faced when the Nazis took advantage of the anti-Semitism of the population and enlisted local police departments to kill Jews and dissidents. When partisans resisted with guerrilla warfare, this pitted neighbor against neighbor, and people couldn't know who to trust. These two brilliant but unspeakably sad films offer us unforgettable Christ-like figures, men who stand up for what is morally right, even in the face of death. The Ascent and In the Fog, they're just really gripping films. Once you've seen them, you will not forget them. Closer to home, on a similar subject, we have the director Ang Lee's 1999 film, Ride with the Devil. It's a look at Missouri and Kansas at the time of the Civil War. Missouri was then on America's western frontier, a state that supported the Union, but it also had a large number of slave-owning families. Tragically, this meant that the Civil War battles there were fought not so much by conventional armies as between neighbors and friends who suddenly became seen as enemies. As for current films, I see the powerful film Oppenheimer as an invitation to take a hard look at a time in American history that feels remarkably contemporary, as anti-Semitism is on the rise, and a brilliant scientist who has served his country well is caught up in the power politics of Washington, D.C., and vilified as a traitor. Well, lest you think that I spend all my time watching depressing films, I want to close this by talking about the films of Agnes Varda, who is considered a national treasure in France. She made her first film at 25 when French cultural norms dictated that young women were not allowed to direct movies. She has spoken about this. She said that you could become a third assistant director in your 20s. And then later you could become a second assistant director, and then a first assistant director, and by the time you were in your 40s, you might become a director. Well, she made her first film at 25. She was a photographer but had no experience in film, but she made a wonderful film about a fishing village that she had known during World War II when her family had gone there to live. And she made this beautiful little film about a fishing village. Well, she made her first movie at 25, and she made her last film at the age of 90. She made several fictional films. Cleo from 5 to 7 is probably the best known. It's about a young woman in Paris who is awaiting the results of a medical test to find out if she has cancer. And it's a beautiful film. But Agnes Varda's true love was making documentaries about ordinary people. Her neighborhood baker, grocer, butcher, mail delivery person. She was guided by a conviction, and I love this statement. She said, "Nothing is banal if you film people with empathy and love." And I think that empathy and love marks all of her work. And she's also said that the three words that have been most essential in making her art over the years are inspiration, creativity, and sharing. They strike me as essential for any human endeavor: parenting, teaching, living a meaningful life. You need inspiration, you need creativity, you need sharing. Deeply humanist and insatiably curious about people. After Varda noticed people scavenging leftover produce at a farmer's market, she began to talk to them. And she said that the great invention of the handheld digital camera came as a real blessing to her, because she's a very petite woman. She's maybe 5 feet tall, 5'2". She could approach people holding this camera, and it wasn't nearly as intimidating as coming with a camera crew, a sound man and a camera guy. She could just approach people. So she started talking to people who were gathering the leftovers from a farmer's market in her town. And eventually this became a film called The Gleaners and I that gave me an invitation to another world I knew nothing about, but it reflects a centuries-old tradition in France. At commercial farms, Varda found that potatoes that were too large, small, or misshapen were left behind, and a whole community had sprung up to glean them. So that's partly what The Gleaners and I is about, getting to know these people. And it's awful to see how many of these potatoes are just discarded. They would just rot if the gleaners weren't there to get them. And this is that wonderful creativity of Varda. She was a photographer, artist, and a filmmaker. She fell in love with heart-shaped potatoes. She just thought they were the cutest thing ever. And she ended up making a video of heart-shaped potatoes, and I think showing it at a major, Venice art show, some major show. So she took, talking to people at the farmer's market, to answering their invitation to learn more about their lives, and then the potato people, and then making this an art show, a multimedia exhibit with heart-shaped potatoes. It's delightful, and she's delightful. The kind of person you see the film and I really wish I knew this lady. She was just wonderful. Her film, The Widows of Noirmoutier, is to my mind her most moving film. It takes place in a small Breton fishing village. In a little over an hour, the town's widows tell you everything about what it means to be a widow. Some were married for over 50 years, others for just a few months. As they show off faded wedding photographs and talk about their husband's last days or the circumstances of their deaths and how they've coped with the devastating absence in their lives, it all rings true. When she made the film in 2006, Varda had been a widow for 16 years. Her husband was Jacques Demy. If you've ever seen The Umbrellas of Cherbourg, that was his most famous film. So they were pretty much a power couple. And one story about them that I love, because his film was pretty well known, they were invited to Hollywood in, I guess, sometimes the early 60s. And Varda has said, well, I went along like a good little woman, but I decided if I didn't like America, I was leaving. And she loved America. She loved Los Angeles. And because of his clout as a filmmaker, she wasn't that well known in America then. They ended up hanging out with some major Hollywood directors and producers, and they got to have lunch with Mae West, which and again, you answer one invitation, and others follow, and follow, and follow. I think this is the continuing nature of invitations. You answer one, and then others just keep coming. That's certainly true in Agnes Varda's life, and I think in my own as well. And when you watch the film about the widows, you realize that these women are not only trusting her with their stories, they're probably telling her things they've likely never admitted to anyone before. And that's kind of the wonder of her, I think, as an artist. And a really great artist offers an invitation to people to do that, to show their vulnerability, to open up, and to say the things they really need to say, but probably haven't been able to share before. And Varda made one of her last films. It's absolutely delightful film called Faces, Places, in 2017, by going on a road trip with a photographer in his 30s. Now she's 89, I think. A young photographer named JR. And he had built a mobile studio for making larger-than-life prints. She calls it his magic bus. And they travel through France. They photograph local people who volunteered to have their images pasted on the walls of their town, or in factories or farms where they work. One of the incredible scenes is at the great port of Le Havre, you know, the giant, that huge seaport for freight and everything. And Agnes Varda notices, they're talking to the men there about what they might do with this project, and the men are kind of, okay, we've got a filmmaker here, what's going on? But they're very game to talk with them. And she said, you know, there are no women here. And so what ends up happening is the men said, well, they all have wives, so the wives are photographed, and they're talking about their lives, and you know, and then what you see is these huge cranes moving boxcars around, and the women end up head-to-toe images like giants overlooking the port at Le Havre. It's just an astonishing, crazy thing to do, but sometimes artists do that, and it's a wonderful scene. And I think the most moving thing they did, they stopped in an old mining town. The mine has been gone for years, but there are plenty of people who had fathers and grandfathers who worked in the mines. And they're talking to a woman who lives, she's one of the few people left in this long brick row houses. And her grandfather was a miner. And people volunteered the photographs of their deceased husbands, fathers, and grandfathers. And they end up pasting them on the walls of these row houses, a building that is scheduled to be demolished. And the people standing there are just amazed. They weep as they see this, because it's crazy but wonderful. And one woman is just, the woman who still lives in the row houses is just speechless. She said, what can I say? She's weeping at seeing her grandfather's image, larger than life, on the wall of the building where he had lived. So I think that in her films, Agnes Varda is offering us an invitation to learn that curiosity, inspiration, creativity, and sharing don't diminish with age. She's offering us a great thank you to the world. That's one of the reviewers said, that her films just felt like a giant thank you. It's just a note of gratitude. But she's offering a great thank you, I think, to the world, to us, to life itself, and above all, an invitation to enter into the dance. So I hope that, invitations come, sometimes out of the blue, like let's do a little e-newsletter on movies, see where that leads. And you answer one invitation and you find you're opening yourself up to a whole world of other invitations. And it's been, last night somebody asked me if how aging had affected my writing and my writing process, that I slowed down. And I said, for a while I thought I'd lost it. I wasn't going to write anymore. In fact, I wrote an essay in the Christian Century kind of about that. I'm wondering, I don't have the energy I used to have, things like that. Has my energy for writing disappeared? Because for a while I wrote all those books when I in the 80s, in the 90s and early 2000s. I was really writing a lot, and then I kind of slowed down and pretty much stopped for a while. Although last night I did read from 2 manuscripts in progress. But this invitation to, hey, let's write about movies, opened up a whole world. I think last year has been one of the most productive years I've ever had as a writer. And I'm 76, so that feels pretty amazing. But answering one invitation hasn't opened up just so many things for me. And one of the upshots is that besides Toll Telegram, my partner in crime, Gareth Higgins, is from Belfast. He's a native of Belfast. He lives part-time in the U.S. and part-time in Northern Ireland. But we are almost finished with a book that will be out next year. From Brazos Press is going to publish it. And it's going to be called A Whole Life in 12 Movies. Cinema and the Spiritual Path. We're still working on the subtitle. But it's basically about films for every stage of life. From birth through childhood to adolescence, the kind of decisions you make in finding your vocation, and then death and beyond. I just finished my essay on, we're each writing 6 essays and then 6 responses to each other's work. And I just finished my last piece, which is on a wonderful Japanese film called Afterlife. I envy anybody watching that film for the first time because it's just so delightful. It's just a really lovely film and makes you think about your life. You see people, it turns out the afterlife, there's a little catch to the afterlife. It's like a rundown schoolhouse, and you go there and you're assigned a task. You have to look at your life, figure out what is the one memory you want to take with you into eternity. Oh my! And you see people of all ages. There's like a teenage girl who's died. There's a bunch of older people. There's middle-aged people, and they have all these memories to sort through and figure out. And then the staff that's there. And why they're there is an interesting part of the whole plot. But they said, we're going to help recreate your memories. And it's all this, it is a rundown schoolhouse, and it's all these funky things. For clouds, they'll use cotton for, balls. These really funky ways to create the memory. And once they film it, and once you've seen it, you disappear. You've entered the afterlife with the one memory you can take with you. And of course, everyone has to think, well, what would that be? My one memory that I can take with you. So again, that will be the chapter on death in the book, because it's just such a wonderful film. I want to share it with as many people as I can. But that's the other nature of answering an invitation. You want to invite other people. to join, to experience maybe some of what you've experienced. So I think probably a bunch of you might be a little surprised that I've talked so much about film, but as you can tell, it's become a major part of my life now. And with the availability of streaming, I can go all over the world. I think one of my next essays in Soul Telegram is going to be about musicians in Mali who are threatened. They've moved to the south in Bamako, which is relatively safe, sort of still run by the government's still in charge there, because they've been threatened with death. The Islamic extremists want to eliminate all music, and they want to kill the musicians. And it's about their stories and their music, and some delightful music. And they managed to have a wonderful music festival a few years ago. That's the film concludes with this mess that they had on the Niger River. But there's a world out there, and I think films offer a unique invitation. They reach more people than books do. I hate to say that, but it's true. In fact, Ousmane, the Senegalese man, he wrote some novels. He started out illiterate, taught himself to read, and then ended up writing several novels in French. But then he realized if he really wanted to reach his African audience, that was what he was interested in, he had to make films. He said, films are the night school of the people, which is a great phrase. So I just think this invitation to the world of cinema has been one of the most remarkable things in my life. So I'm very glad to be able to share some of that with you. And if you want notes on any of the movies, I'd be happy to jot some down for you. But I do tend to watch a lot of really depressing movies, but I like the fun stuff too. So anyway, this invitation has just been the greatest invitation, because you told me I could talk about whatever I wanted to talk about, which is like, that never happens to writers. We're always saying, we want you to talk about this topic or this book you wrote 10 years ago or this kind of thing. This has just been a lovely invitation. So I just thank you for being attentive and listening to me rant on and on about movies. But thank you so much.
We're going to take a pause, like a stretch break, so don't go get coffee or anything. And then Kathleen will answer any questions that folks might have.
I will entertain.
She'll entertain questions. And don't ask her what her favorite movie is, because Okay, y'all. Does anybody have any questions that they'd like to ask Kathleen?
So I'm asking this on behalf of a friend of mine who teaches creative writing here in town and attended your lecture last night. But I guess he was struck by, as you were reading some of your memoir, about how maybe you were a little self-deprecating, or perhaps it was ambiguous whether you're like the hero of the story or always making right choices. So if, assuming that's accurate or that you track with that assessment, what advice would you give to other writers about how to write memoir in a way that isn't just a defense of all your actions or doesn't kind of make you the center of the story, but reveals your flaws?
That's really important, because I've judged manuscript contests, and I talked to Patricia Hampel, who's a wonderful writer herself, and we both were just being very upset because we were reading these memoirs that people had interesting stories to tell, but they couldn't get out of the way. You couldn't enter the story because they were always me, I. And so we both devised this little, I've done this a few times, talking about taking the me out of memoir, because it's really important to do that, and even checking for how many times you use I or me or my in a text, and removing it is important, because if you're there all the time, you're blocking the reader from really entering the story, and that's a dangerous thing. It's very common. Patricia Hampel, the year she judged this contest, she couldn't find a manuscript she liked well enough to get it published. And I said, well, I found one that was really great. I wasn't crazy about the runner-up. It was very polished prose, but it didn't really strike you in the heart. The book I chose was a wonderful memoir of growing up in a working class family with a mother. She had children by a bunch of different men, and you might expect a bitter, nasty memoir, but instead it was this loving memoir of the family and the mother and understanding. And the young woman didn't talk about how she kind of escaped that life, because she's now teaching at a university and obviously writing a really great book. But somehow some teacher recognized how bright she was and maybe helped her get a scholarship or something. So she made her way out, and it was a wonderful, wonderful book. And so I was happy to do that, but it's a real trap you can fall into. And one of the things about that memoir about my sister, I think anybody who has sisters, you know that if you puff up and act all proud and stuff, you're going to get knocked down. And so self-deprecating in terms of my sister, that was not a hard thing to do, because she was always, I remember our mom, I didn't tell the story last night, but at our mom's funeral, I was doing one of the eulogies, and Becky whispered, "Don't mess this up." You know, that kind of thing, keeping me in check. So sisters are really good at that, as anybody who's had one knows. So that helps too. And just trying to be grounded in, that I'm not the center of the universe, and I'm kind of glad I'm not. That would be a big job. And then also the good old-fashioned Benedictine emphasis on humility. Writers are not known for their humility at all, and it takes a lot of nerve to write something and expect other people to read it. But you really can put a check on the ego. And my first job out of college was working at a place in New York City, the Academy of American Poets, and I learned a lot about the kind of writer I didn't want to be. Really monsters of ego. I'm thinking, wow, how do you go through life like this, just using other people and just being so full of yourself? So I kind of had that instruction, kind of moral instruction in an odd way, thinking about what kind of writer I wanted to be, and it wasn't that. And how do you do that and stuff? But that's a serious question, I think, especially for people writing memoirs, because you are writing about yourself. And so you have to be there, but you really can't be the hero of every story. You can't be at the center. You have to leave room for the reader. So thank you for that question.
That brings up a question that kind of came up as I was listening to you talk about all of these very contextual films. Stories from a very particular place in a very particular way of inhabiting the world. And I feel like you write in a particular context, as, Kathleen Norris, who lives in Honolulu and lived in
Hangs out with
Dakotas,
monks.
et cetera, et cetera. How do you derive truth that is universal? I hesitate to use that word, but truth that feels transcendent in some way from these sort of very particular kind of stories?
I think you have to be particular. It's one of those weird paradoxes of writing. I think it's true of art also. Is you're being very particular and concrete about the details that you're dealing with, like in Tehran or in Honolulu or whatever. But the more particular you are, it's actually the more universal. The more people will say, I understand that, I've been through that, or whatever. It's a weird paradox, but I think I really depend on that I'm not, when I'm being particular, I'm not shutting other people out, I'm actually inviting them in. Because this is an experience, grieving my sister's death, grieving my husband's death. That's an experience that is mine, very personal, concrete, but other people know what this is like. That would be a good example when you're writing about grief, because you have to be particular. But it's also inviting other people to connect with their own experience? Well, make him work, do his cardio, get his cardio in.
This is my Phil Donahue impression.
So I'm a librarian, and I deal a lot with like the book challenges and all of that that's going on right now. And I'm just curious with how much you've exposed yourself to movies set in cultures that have a lot of censorship, like what you have learned that maybe speaks to the current situation here.
Oh, thank you for being a librarian. Some of the most important people in the world. The librarians at the Hawaii State Library got so used to me, I would go there almost every day after school, and I discovered the Reader's Guide to Periodical Literature for magazines. I would spend all afternoon until they kicked me out, just looking up stuff and finding articles. And librarians have been really important in my life. And for years, I worked for a tiny public library in Lemon, South Dakota, my mom's hometown, where my grandparents lived. And we occasionally, we didn't have the kind of crazy atmosphere that exists now, where people are just going crazy with censorship. But I remember we did have a guy come in. It was a very tiny Lutheran denomination, the Church of the Lutheran Confession. I think there's only about 500 of them in the world, but they broke off from Missouri Synod because it was too liberal. So they're pretty out there. And this guy came in and he was very upset. We had a children's book that had bare-breasted mermaids. And it was a wonderfully illustrated children's book. It had just a lovely thing of octopus. It was under the sea, everything under the sea, and octopus ink, and this lovely little story, and a teddy bear that falls down into the ocean and has to be rescued. It's a beautiful little children's book. And so we just listened to him and said, yeah, okay, well, we put it away for a few weeks and then put it back out on the shelf. I mean, we didn't have to deal with crazy censorship, and because I think once you start that, where do you stop? The Bible has a lot of pretty objectionable stuff in it. So you start censoring the Bible, or do you start censoring everything? But I really, and Hawaii is fairly liberal and that sort of thing. We don't have I don't think the librarians, they have other problems, but like dealing with homeless population who want to move in and kind of spend the whole day in the library, and there are problems there, but I don't think there's a huge problem with organized groups trying to censor things. Hawaii is a little more, the Aloha spirit, a little more laid back about that kind of thing. But it's got to be a hard time to be a librarian, and I'm just very happy to see there was a thing on the news recently about people banding together to support a public library that was resisting censorship. I think it might have been in Pennsylvania. But I think if people, don't let these small groups of fanatics really try to censor everything under the sun, we need some good resistance from groups that realize that, books are there for people to read and learn from, and if they're telling a difficult history, like some of the films I talked about, some very difficult history, if you don't know your own history, you're doomed. And so I just want to thank you for being a librarian. And have you had any particular problems, instances with censorship?
I'm actually a school librarian, so for me it happens more as I'm choosing purchased books.
Yeah.
But there is a group in town that has signaled they might be looking into our collection soon. And I'm a high school librarian, so my collection is very much targeted.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Yeah. And it's just a struggle. And of course, again, like that example I gave in Iran, people will look for information. They want information. They want to learn things. And I think people will find a way, but it's just tragic to me that you have really beautiful books sometimes that, people will jump on something and just get so agitated about it, and it's nothing. Like bare-breasted mermaids, who knew they should be wearing coconut shell bras like they do at some of the tourist luau's? I don't know. I mean, it just, struck me. But that was the way we dealt with it. It was very rare that we had an objection, and we'd put the book aside for a while to nod and agree, say thank you for telling us or something, and then we just put it right back out. We never took it seriously. Didn't have to. It was great. It was great. More.
We have several librarians here, actually, as I look around, which is a wonderful thing. Other questions for Kathleen? I have a vaguely, and then Daryl, vaguely, what's your favorite movie question? Even though I told the people not to ask that question. What would be a movie, perhaps an unexpected one, that you think says something about the Christian life?
About the Christian life. Well, I don't know if it says something something specifically about the Christian life. Because, I started out as a poet, and I'm always writing for a general audience. I'm not writing for a particular audience of Christians or anyone else. It's just a general literary audience. And that's kind of how I see films. But, there are films, Wonder Woman 1984, there's a speech in there that's absolutely incredible about how greed destroys people, and you need to pull back and decide, do you really want this, or what is it costing you? It's an incredible speech in a superhero movie. Of course, Wonder Woman is probably the most human of the superheroes. She's pretty cool, but at least my grandnieces think so. But there's a speech in there that you would not expect to find, but it's morally instructive, and you realize millions of people are hearing this speech, which is kind of good. I know that because that's one of the movies in our book, and I just wrote a response to it. I don't like superhero movies that much, but that one that one is okay. I actually, I understood why my friend Gareth wanted to include it in the book. I'm trying to think, because I think we're talking about values and valuing, respecting human life and accepting people the way God accepts us. And there's really quite a few films, I think, that do that. There's a beautiful film called Patterson. It's very slow paced, so a lot of people don't like it, but it's about a guy in New Jersey. He's a city bus driver, but he also writes poetry. And it's just the way his neighbors accept him. He's accepted as he just has this very, he's an ex-Marine with a Muslim wife. You don't ever find out how that happened, what's there. But he's devoted to her, he's devoted to the public, serving the public. He's just a decent guy. And he's living his life, doing what he loves, but loving people. And films like that, quiet films like that, values, like the film Nebraska. Has anyone seen that one? About a father and son that represent values. They're not overtly Christian in talking about Christianity, but they certainly represent the values that I think of as Christian values. I'm trying to think of other. Silence, the film about the Japanese Jesuit, the martyrs in Japan, is a pretty powerful film. Like all Martin Scorsese movies, it's too long, but it's good. What do you think of it when you think of a movie that kind of represents Christian values?
My favorite one is Pulp Fiction.
Oh yeah.
And honestly, it's because by the end, it reveals that you're not going to accomplish anything through virtue alone, and that grace is required.
Yeah, and that's a tough film. I mean, that's a tough film because of violence and a number of things. But I think you're right. And another film that most people wouldn't think of, I think, as valuing life, valuing human life and everything, because it is a violent film, is Fargo. But the thing that, in fact, I'm going to be writing about this pretty soon, but I'm thinking about this a lot. because I love that film for a lot of reasons. I mean, the landscape is familiar to me. The way people talk is familiar to me. A lot of the characters in the book feel like I know. But there's this wonderful policewoman, this pregnant policewoman, and she and her husband are just really decent people. And they're wonderful people, but she's a policewoman, so she's dealing with psychopaths, murders, serious crime, and she doesn't lose herself in any of it. She remains herself. She remains devoted to her husband, devoted to this baby she's going to give birth to, devoted to having a decent life. And when you see what she's confronting, the characters, the evil stuff that she's confronting, the end of the movie is the thing that was the key for me, and the scene makes me weep when I watch it now. She's got a murderer, really a psychopath, a brilliant actor named Peter Stormare who plays psychopaths really well. But he's in the back seat of her police car. She's seen him committing a murder, pretty violent murder, and she's managed to arrest him. He's in the back of the police car, and you know he would just soon kill her. As look at her, he's really gone. He's lost. In the back car, they're driving down a snow-covered road in North Dakota. Snowy landscape, gray skies. And she's talking to him, how many people have you killed, and all for a little bit of money? Don't you know that life is more than money? She said, just look, it's a beautiful day. You go. She's looking at North Dakota in the winter, and it's a beautiful day. It's just the most stunning. She believes that. Every day to her, I think, is a beautiful day. She doesn't come out and say, God made it, or any of that. But somebody said, well, that's a nihilistic film. And I said, oh, no, not when you meet Marge. She is definitely not a nihilistic character, and she's the one who carries the film. She really does. I mean, you have all these murders and these people, and it has a very moralistic, the wages of sin is death. When you see Fargo, you understand what that means. But then you've got Marge. All for a little money? Don't you know there's more to life than money? Look, it's a beautiful day. It's just a stunning scene, but you have to get through about 8 murders to get there. I mean, it's the Coen brothers, their weird sense of humor, but that to me is just really a profound. It would be nice to think of a movie where you don't have to get through 8 murders, but that's kind of where we are right now. But that I think of that as a morality tale, really. The wages of sin is death. And the people who are committing crimes and, they're just losing themselves in these evil things they're doing. And they have no idea how badly they're losing themselves, but they are, and they're losing everything. And there's good old Marge in her police car just driving along.
It's a beautiful day.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, my question was already answered, but I do have a news flash, and that is that the actors' strike is over, according to what's on our phones, which is
Oh,
good
really?
news.
Oh, I know.
Yes.
I have some
Well,
friends who are going to be happy about that. I have some friends who were happy when the writers' strike ended.
Yeah, the director's is over too, of course. So a very pragmatic question. I'm just guessing that your Iranian films you're not watching on the Disney Channel. And so where do you get your Iranian films?
I do watch some films on the Disney Channel because I actually like Star Wars stuff and Mandalorian. And I have a friend who's a director who had directed an episode of The Mandalorian. My claim to fame is falling asleep during the biggest fight scene in The Bourne Supremacy. I was tired. I was in a movie theater. I was tired. It was boring. I just went, wah. And the person I was with thought it was hilarious. But I tend to get really bored with fight scenes and like the space stuff, all the ships going. But my friend Isaac Chun, who did Minari, which is a beautiful movie about a family, Korean American immigrants. He's a really, he's a Christian. He's a really sweet guy. He directed an episode of The Mandalorian that had a terrific fight scene that actually had me going, yeah, like this at the end. I'm streaming it, so it can happen. I can actually watch it. But I do watch Disney. I subscribe to a number. The Criterion Channel is a miracle for $10 a month. It has all kinds of classics and foreign films. I've discovered a number of films there. Amazon Prime is pretty good. And for years, and I still do this to some extent, I find out about a film festival, I find out what's showing there, and I keep looking to see if it's available for streaming, because eventually a lot of that stuff is, and I'll wait a long time. I don't need to see the latest thing all the time. And I do go to theaters. There's a couple. I did see Oppenheimer and Barbie in theaters. I'm looking forward to seeing The Holdovers by Alexander Payne. He's a brilliant director. He did Nebraska. He did The Descendants about Hawaii. I'm looking forward to seeing Killers of the Flower Moon. I've read both the nonfiction book in Linda Hogan, who's a Chickasaw, her novel called Mean Spirit that is about that episode because that affected her family. So I've been familiar with that story for a while. I want to see that movie. There's a number of things. I'll go to theaters, but Amazon Prime, Max, which has HBO and stuff, that's another one that I will subscribe to. So I ended up subscribing to a lot of different places, but I think Criterion and Amazon, and sometimes Netflix. Netflix is showing more foreign films too, along with American stuff and some junk. You just wade through it, and there's a lot of junk I won't pay any attention to. But then there's stuff that surprises me. I think it's going to be junk, and it isn't. It's actually pretty interesting. I love being surprised by when I expect something to be banal or stupid, and then it turns out to be kind of interesting. But yeah, it's a whole world out there that's available. And I know there are there's Mubi, M-U-B-I, which is proved to be very interesting. They have a lot of very obscure things that most places don't have. And I recently, last year, I got interested in them, and I subscribed to that one too. I spend most of my money on streaming, I think. Streaming and books, those two things. And there's a thing called Just Watch. You can find out where something is streaming or if it's available. It's a little website called Just Watch. And that's what I use sometimes to find out where things are showing.
What I didn't think I'd be thinking at this time of the evening is I want to watch movies with Kathleen Norris. That's like
Yeah, we could.
That's now my dream.
Yeah, we should do that.
Yeah.
We should.
Yeah.
What's playing downtown?
Trains, Planes, and Automobiles is on at the Paramount this weekend, which is.
I don't know if I could
in
live
honor
through
of,
that one again.
Actually, the Paramount. We should talk about that anyway. Moving on. Are there any other questions? Yeah.
Okay.
The filmmaker that her husband, you said they were a power couple, and her husband did The Umbrellas of Sherbert.
Oh, Jacques Demy, D-E-M-Y.
D-E-M-Y?
M-Y, Jacques Demy. That was, They were married for many, many years. I think when they were in their 20s, they got married. And that's probably his most famous film. So he became known as a filmmaker before she did.
And what was her name again?
Agnes Varda, V-A-R-D-A, Agnes. And she's just delightful. She's like everybody's grandma. And there's some scenes in her films with J.R. because he's in his 30s and he wears shades and he has a little hipster hat and you think he's too cool for school. Then he takes her to meet his 100-year-old grandmother who calls him Little Sweetie. And you think, he's a human being too. He's not behind the shades and the hipster stuff. And there's some marvelous intergenerational banter between Agnes Varda and this, who's 89, 90, and then this young photographer. It's just really a fun film in that way. Faces Places. And that's widely available because it won an Oscar and stuff like that.
Time for one more.
A burning question.
Yeah. Well, or we could just thank you for being here. Thank you so much,
so
Kathleen.
much.
Kathleen will be preaching at our 10:30 service this coming Sunday, and so I hope you'll join us for that. No hellfire, no damnation, but she will be talking about the mean girls at the beginning of Matthew 25. So the Lord be with you. Also with you. Let us pray. Keep watch, dear Lord, with those who work or watch or weep this night. And give your angels charge over those who sleep. Tend the sick, Lord Christ. Give rest to the weary. bless the dying, soothe the suffering, pity the afflicted, shield the joyous, and all for your love's sake. Amen. Thank you all very much. Have a good night.